welcome to Dialogues in Design. Today we are going to be talking to Sana Tabassum. She is the creative director of To Scale, a communication studio and platform dedicated to empowering emerging creatives and help brands tell authentic stories. Hi, Sana. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, great to be here as well. Thank you.
So, to start with, I would love to know about your journey from architecture, communication, storytelling, and then building a creative community. What were some of your key turning points?
Sure. So, just for context, I am based in the UK, in London. I studied here pretty much my whole life. So my education is from here, and I decided to start studying architecture in 2016. And I kind of went into the industry not really knowing, not really knowing much about what the career entailed. I didn't have any mentors. I didn't really have any points of references. So I almost went into it blind because I thought I had some skills in sort of art and design, and then I didn't really necessarily want to do anything science related. So this was like a good mix of not too creative, but something that seemingly at the time seemed to be a good career prospect. Um, I then did my undergraduate at the University of Greenwich, which was a very quick experience, I would say. The 3 years went by very, very quickly. And during that time, I think a key turning point actually would be failing in the first year. And it's not as bad as it sounds. You are able to sort of resubmit and then kind of carry forward during the summer. So it was kind of like a sort of kick in the face almost, because I felt like, okay, I really need to pull my socks up and start getting comfortable with things like technical design, with being more confident and presenting to people, because that's, again, a big part of university that no one really tells you about. So I did, yeah, so I completed my undergraduate, and I was essentially looking for a job for an entire year. I gave about 10 different interviews during that year, which I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, because I think getting to the interview stage is also extremely difficult, but I wasn't really sure why I wasn't landing the jobs. And then COVID happened. And just as COVID was happening, or just I think as we were coming out of the first lockdown, I managed to secure my first job. And this was primarily in a very small practice that specialized in care home design. So it was quite niche. And similarly, my experience was a little bit disconnected because of lockdown, because I ended up getting furloughed, and because most of the time, at least for about 4 or 5 months, I was often in the office by myself. So I didn't really have that kind of structure, or I didn't really have that support as you would when you get experience after graduating university. And so during this time, I was really itching to get back to study and get back to university and do more fun stuff. I then did my master's back at the same university at Greenwich. And those 2 years were really, really amazing. I think once you come into master's, you get a lot more independence and you get more freedom to really explore the things that you enjoy about design. So I definitely got to do that. And whilst I was doing this, whilst I was doing all of this, really, I had started a blog after I graduated my undergrad. And so I was sort of putting content out there to kind of help other architecture students like myself who, couldn't really ask anyone. There's no like tutorials or things online, at least there weren't then. Um, so it was kind of in a way just to document what I had learned and share it with other people. And along this journey, I ended up starting to create content. And this was around the time when Reels started coming in for the first time. And so I thought, okay, I really need to just push myself, be a bit confident, and get on camera. And so I did. And that's kind of how the content creation part of it started. And so after finishing masters, I wasn't really looking forward to going back to practice, because I'd realized that, I really enjoy making digital content, marketing. I'd done quite a few freelance jobs in sort of architecture and social media startups. And so that gave me a taste for like the freelance life. And I really knew that the 9 to 5 wasn't for me at all. And so yeah, I got a bit of taste of that, but I thought, okay, no, let me give architecture a fair chance and actually get back into practice. So I worked in practice for about a year and a half after that in a sort of medium-ish practice in London, and I was working on commercial retrofit projects. However, I was doing that freelance, and they were very kind enough to like give me that opportunity and flexibility. So again, I could still kind of pursue other projects, and that's also when Open Studio began, and we can talk about that later as well. But it just allowed for me to pursue other things alongside this sort of part-time role. And then last year in July, I made the move to communications, and that really came out of just kind of foreseeing and planning for the future because I figured, at least in the UK here, it takes, a minimum of 7 years to actually get qualified as an architect. And it's just way too long and it has so many barriers to that pathway. And I just couldn't see like a future along that path for myself. I wasn't really that passionate about qualifying as an architect. So I figured I would sort of lean into my strengths and pivot completely to the communications and marketing that I was already doing. So I already had a couple of clients preparing sort of brands and websites or, one-off events and exhibitions for them. So that was kind of like the big risk that I took last year. And yeah, I think it paid off because luckily this year I have gotten about 13, 14 projects under my belt so far. And so I'm kind of like really leaning into the communications part and storytelling part of architecture still. I am also freelancing as a communications coordinator in another architecture practice. So that still helps me to kind of see this niche from a business standpoint and kind of from an in-house standpoint too. So yeah, it's been quite a sort of mixed and roller coaster of a journey, but yeah, I think those are the sort of big moments so far.
Wow, that's been such an amazing journey to, go to architecture school and then explore and then the niche that you have found. That is just amazing. One thing that you spoke about is confidence. There was a lot of confidence required for all the decisions that you took, whether it was getting into architecture school, getting through all of the design crits and juries,
Mhm,
pursuing masters, and now what you have found the niche, pursuing that. There's a lot of
mhm,
confidence. How do you think that someone can build that confidence to put themselves out there online, to find that voice that you found?
mhm. Yeah, definitely. I'm like a naturally introverted person, so making content online is the most uncomfortable thing that I could have possibly done. It's still very uncomfortable. Like I still struggle to get on camera and say the things that I want to say. But I think for someone starting out, the main thing is to just start small. So I often tell students who kind of say, how do I start building my digital presence? I'm still a student. I don't really know what I have to say online. It's just about either documenting or showcasing a solution to a problem. So, what I mean by that is if you're in university and you're working on a project, your design project, for example, every week, just take the time to write a post for about 5 minutes about what happened during that week, what your tutors told you, what feedback they gave, the things that you've been thinking about or researching, and just summarize all of that into one post. And obviously, whilst you're in university and you're doing this every week, you'll have at least maybe like 15 to 20 posts throughout the year. So that's a really good way to kind of start building that confidence. It eases the pressure that you don't necessarily have to, film and record yourself. It's just kind of like a little bit external. You kind of put your thoughts into it retrospectively rather than, um, yeah, putting yourself out there. Because I know it's a very scary thing, and I think also the reason people struggle with LinkedIn a lot is because it's much more connected to the real world than Instagram is. Your name is out there, you're connecting with people you actually know in real life. So it's a lot harder and I really appreciate that. But I think people just don't do that enough. So if you can be that one person who is doing it, you're already putting yourself at an advantage. At least that's how I see it.
That's an interesting perspective. I love that take on it. So, you are speaking a lot about putting yourself out there and, creating a personal brand. How important do you think that it is to create a personal brand? Create a narrative for yourself, be it for students, be it for young graduates. And should someone actively pursue that?
It really depends on what your goals are. Obviously, for a lot of architecture students, the goal really is to graduate and find a job and get that experience, right? And I think for decades now, we've seen that that has been an issue globally, not even sort of in my country alone. It's something that is not changing anytime soon either. But just going on the journey I've had and the personal experience that I've seen, it was much easier for me to land a job after I had built this audience or built this personal brand rather than when I came out of university with literally no experience, no online presence, nothing. Um, Even though my work was just as good. And so I think the reason people should be building a personal brand is really to have that kind of like presence online because it really works for you in the background. So in the future, you know, after you have gotten a job or anything, in the future, if you're thinking about starting your own practice, you've still got a level of credibility and authority through your personal brand. So it's not necessarily that you have to just constantly post, and then you'll magically find a job. It's more so like finding that niche, like you said, and finding what makes you unique or what kind of can you bring to the table. Because people are good at different things, but they kind of don't tend to get very specific with it. And I think it's taken me like a very long time to get really specific with it too. Because I mean, the whole of last year, I was very confused whether I should be pursuing architecture because I still love design or whether I should be pursuing communications because that's where my strengths and experience lie as well. So it's kind of tricky, but you have to do that sort of internal process to figure out what your goals are in a sense.
That makes so much sense. Yeah, that's true. Having an inner dialogue is quite important while finding your niche. So, apart from personal branding, there seems to be a huge gap from what the university teaches or what skills we develop at school and what the field actually needs.
Mhm.
You have been out in the field for quite some time. You have been on the communication side as well and on the working side as well. What do you think are some skills that young graduates can develop to, bridge this gap?
Um, I'll probably be biased in saying this, but probably communication. I think a lot of people would tend to say software. And I know that's a very big hurdle when it comes to landing a job is people always, you know, it always kind of like dilutes down to, okay, but do you know Revit? Do you know ArchiCAD? And unfortunately, like that's not really the point of practice at all. I've experienced jobs where, you know, even senior associates, directors, they did not know Revit at all. They did not sit there doing that work. And it's just very ironic and almost hypocritical. But I think if you know, the right practices are the ones who really care about nurturing emerging talent, they will not necessarily care that you don't know how to use Revit because at the end of the day, it's just a software. You can still learn that throughout your job. And sometimes it is the responsibility of the practice to kind of let you do that or help you learn. So I think software is not the barrier that we should be focusing on. I think it's communication is the skill that a lot of graduates tend to miss, and a part of that comes from not being taught communication in university. So you know we're asked to write essays or we're asked to present during crits, but no one really tells you how to do that or how to speak about your work or how to take someone on that journey of what your project is going to solve. So, you know, I'm not saying that that should be coming from making content. It can come from a variety of things. You could write a blog, you could, I don't know, do poetry. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be very limited to just within architecture either. But I think that's, yeah, I think that's the skill that I would recommend graduates start learning because if you're applying for one job and there's about 300 applications, how are you really going to stand out? Because the level of quality of work is pretty much the same all across. So it's really how you communicate who you are as a person and what you value and how this aligns with that practice, is what's going to set you apart, really.
That makes so much sense. Communication is really important. That's so true. One really nice thing that you said, what caught me, is that good firms who want to nurture talent won't actually focus on the software skills because they can be learned. That is so true. We keep talking about what skills young graduates, young architects, designers should develop. But what do you think are some things like the architecture firms or people in the industry can do to become more accommodative and inclusive of the new talent of these newcomers?
That's a really, really good question. And it's like the answer lies in part of why I started Open Studio. So Open Studio is a series of workshops and events that I run twice a month, and I've been doing that for the past 2 years. And essentially, it was in an effort mainly from my frustration of not finding a job after masters. It took me like 3 or 4 months, I think, so still a significant amount of time. But I was more unsure of what kind of practice do I actually want to work at? What kind of projects do I want to be doing? What kind of culture do I want from this team? And so at Open Studio, I tried to invite a series of like graduates who are currently job seeking to various London practices and see what it's all about. So typically they'll give a presentation about all those points, and then they'll sit down and kind of talk to you about your CV and portfolio. And what that has kind of taught me is that I think there is definitely a gap that needs to be bridged, but I think that can only happen when you're actively doing things and not kind of just saying that there is a gap. I think there's, a long-standing history of people, especially in senior level positions, kind of just talking about the problem, but not actively doing anything to help solve it. I think bigger practices are in the position of obviously offering a lot more support through mentoring or internal initiatives where they are kind of supporting those younger designers, or they have opportunities, to provide scholarships or help existing organizations that are already offering those things to kind of like continue people's journey in that pathway. Because, like I said before, like there's so many barriers, so many women, so many people of color don't end up actually qualifying as architects because they haven't been given that support. So I think practices do need to step up in a way and be a lot more, again, open and communicative too, because I'm sure you can relate, like just applying and applying and applying to jobs and not really hearing anything back. And if you don't get that feedback loop, then I think it's equally as difficult for that practice because they might not even know what they're looking for, because they haven't communicated that well.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, that's true that there's a gap between the firms and the students. And
Mm.
everything that we perceive as young designers, and we think that, oh, these are the skills that we should actually build. So, through Open Studio and through communicating with all of these firms, there are a lot of misconceptions young graduates have about, you know, what
Hmm.
skills are actually
Yeah.
required, what kind of work is being done in the firms. What do you think are some common misconceptions that young graduates may have?
Um, I suppose the software bit is one. But also I think one during like the sort of application process is that a lot of people think that practices put their applications and CVs through a lot of screening or filtering software. That's really not the case. Even some of the bigger practices that we've seen, they explicitly say that, we get people to like filter through these applications. Each one is seen by at least one person. So their like method or their sort of like process might be different, but I think most, or if not all, of the practices that I've seen and have done an open studio at, which is about 2025, they've all said that, we never kind of filter through, we never kind of put it through AI, or we don't kind of look out for specific keywords. I think it's more about, yeah, I think it's just a lot of graduates tend to think that they're already at a disadvantage even before applying, but that's not really the case. So I think that's a big misconception. But I think there's equally a lot of research to be done as to, what are you actually doing in practice? Because I think stereotypically the viewpoint has been that if you're working at a bigger practice, you get to work on bigger projects. But, and I've heard this from all, friends, from peers that, sometimes you do end up just doing one little detail in like the massive building, and that's what you're only working on for the next 3 or 6 months. And, some people might not want that experience despite having a big practice name behind them. So I think really understanding what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis is one of the things that doesn't really get talked about a lot. I know you said misconceptions, but yeah, I think that's a misconception too. I think some people, link the sort of big practice name to a better job somehow, but that's really not the case.
Yeah, that's true. I think the scale of the project is a huge misconception among young graduates and students.
Hmm.
And it's a relief to know that you said that the CVs and portfolios don't get screened automatically through AI, and there is actually a human behind the
Hmm.
screen who is going through it.
Yeah,
So
for
that
sure.
makes, yeah, that makes storytelling much more important through the CV and portfolio as well, because it's like connecting to the human behind the screen. So how do you think can we get the storytelling into the portfolio and the CV that we build? How can we, stand out, build a
Hmm.
narrative among that?
So there's a really great book and concept called The Unfair Advantage. And I've kind of adopted this and sort of made it my own and called it invisible seasoning. So something that I tell a lot of graduates is, for example, when you're talking about yourself in your cover letter or in your like profile CV, for example, a lot of graduates will start saying, I'm a really enthusiastic part one architectural assistant from the University of so and so. And the problem with that is that you're defining yourself based on your education and your, I guess, level of experience. You're not really telling me anything about you. And so if I'm an employer and I'm, flicking through, like I said, 250, 300 CVs, and they all start the same way, there's nothing distinct and there's nothing unique that's really telling me about you or why I think you might be a good fit for this practice. Another good point is that a lot of studios, and they might say this during interview stage, is that they're really looking for, yes, they want someone to kind of tick all their boxes technically, but they are also looking for someone who can fit into their studio culture. So, for example, if a practice is really, really sociable, or they do international trips, or they, I don't know, have like an internal running club or something like that, if you don't really align with those kinds of things, then you might not be the right fit. So I think as great as, software skills, portfolio stuff is, important, I think the personable aspect is also equally important. And so that really comes through defining and learning about what your unfair advantage or your invisible seasoning is. And often I say it's kind of, you have to sort of distill it down to a combination of two things. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, let's say you're really good at architecture visualizations, but you're also really interested in, I don't know, the emotions behind images. So in that Venn diagram, your invisible seasoning would be, I can create architectural visualizations that invoke various emotions. So if a practice is working on a residential project and they want to kind of highlight how it's for a certain community and they want to convey, inclusivity, for example, that's something that you can bring to that practice. And so in that profile, what you would then start with is something like, like I just said, I really enjoy bringing emotion to visualizations or however it is. So if you're starting with that, immediately that gets my attention. It gets my kind of like, yeah, interest, as opposed to just starting based off of your experience and education. Because they can read that in your CV anyway.
Wow, that's such an interesting take. I love the invisible seasoning. So, getting beyond the portfolio and connecting with the people behind the firm is such an amazing thing to do as young graduates. This has been such an amazing conversation with you. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone out there, young graduates, would benefit so much from this conversation. Just to end with, if some young graduate is really struggling today, confused with what to do, how to be out there, how to apply for jobs, how to, personalize their portfolio and CV in a way that they can connect more efficiently, what do you think can be the first step they can do? What do you think can be some goals they can set for themselves, probably within this week, this month, or
Mm.
something like that? Set a timeline to it.
A good thing to do, probably if you already have an existing portfolio, is talk through it and see if you can connect the dots. So, something that I always recommend is that each page should be linked to the one next to it and the one after it and the one before it. So if you're talking about one project and it's about, community housing, and then you suddenly move on to like furniture design, like how do you connect the two? Is it through a design ethos? Is it through your invisible seasoning? So I would just take the time to kind of like make sure that you practice how you're going to really present that portfolio and make sure that there's some kind of underlying thread or story through that. Equally, you can talk about it to someone else and see if it makes sense. So I think just like practicing that communication can be a really good short-term goal.
Thank you so much, Sana, for talking to me today and giving all these amazing insights. They
Yeah,
were
thank
of
you.
so much help to me, and I can't wait to actually start practicing this. And I
Sure,
love
of
the
course.
ideology of the invisible seasoning.
Great, I'm glad. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me on. It's been great.